When we talk about cities getting bigger, our minds usually jump to these huge, sprawling megacities. But what about the smaller ones? Especially coastal cities and river deltas, like Barishal in Bangladesh. They're facing a really serious problem that we don't often talk about. They're literally being squeezed by climate change. So let's get right into it. The whole research project really boils down to this one fascinating question. How on earth does a city grow when it's physically blocked from spreading out? And this points to a really big gap in our understanding. See, most of the research out there is all about the megacities, but these smaller coastal cities are incredibly vulnerable and just haven't been studied enough. They're dealing with some really unique threats, like their riverbanks literally eroding away. To figure this out, researchers looked at a huge chunk of time, 2 full decades of data, tracking exactly how Barishal changed from the year 2000 all the way to 2020. Their method was this really clever three-step process. First, they got their hands on 20 years' worth of satellite images. Then, they used this cool technique called remote sensing, which basically let them map out every single change to the city's physical footprint. And finally, they layered on top of that super detailed population data, so they could see not just where the city grew, but how many more people were living there. So, what did they find after all that work? Well, the first thing was pretty straightforward. The city's actual built-up area got bigger by a pretty significant 43 square kilometers. And at the very same time, its population jumped by over 67,000 people. So on the surface, you'd think, okay, just a simple story of a city getting bigger. But here's where it gets really interesting. This growth wasn't your typical, simple outward sprawl. Nope, it was seriously limited, basically boxed in by the riverbanks constantly washing away. And this right here is the key discovery. Because the city couldn't spread out horizontally, the river was in the way, it was forced to grow in a totally different way, inward and upward. The city had no other choice but to get denser. This perfectly captures the study's main takeaway. It shows that environmental barriers don't just stop growth cold, they can completely change it, forcing cities to take on entirely new shapes and forms. Now, a finding like this has huge implications for city planners. It makes it crystal clear that we need things like urban growth boundaries, special zoning for areas at high risk of erosion, and a serious investment in infrastructure that can actually hold up. At the end of the day, Barishal's story is so much bigger than just one city. It's basically a blueprint, a case study for hundreds of other Delta cities all over the world. It gives us a real glimpse into how we might plan for a smarter, more resilient future on a planet that's facing some serious pressure.